So in the last video, we looked at what organisms are made of. And the second thing that we look at when we're studying living things is their habitat. So animals and plants, in order to survive, they have to have a place to live. And that the place that they live is called their habitat. And their habitat is made up of two things. It's made up of biotic and abiotic factors. So abiotic factors are the physical and chemical characteristics that make up where they live. So abiotic means not living, so they're the physical and chemical things. The biotic factors are actually the living things that make up their habitat. So let's look at a few of the abiotic factors that will affect the habitat of a living thing, and then we'll look at some of the biotic factors. So one of the main abiotic factors that will affect a living thing would be sunlight. So if an organism is a plant, it's going to have sunlight in order to do photosynthesis to make its food. And so it's going to have to be able to have sunlight. If it's an animal, they might need to have the sunlight in order to be able to see to find their food. And if there's not enough sunlight, then they can't see and they can't find their food and they would die. So the amount of sunlight is also going to affect a living thing. It will also affect whether or not the animal dries out. So when we talk about things that are living in the intertidal zone, the amount of sunlight can actually affect how quickly an organism dries out, which can affect if the animal dies or not. The temperature will also be a physical characteristic that will affect living things. So many things that live in the ocean are what we call ectotherms, meaning their body temperature depends on the surrounding water temperature. And so they can't maintain their own body temperature. It changes with the surroundings. So the abiotic factor of temperature will affect the body temperature of these organisms. Also, that temperature affecting the body temperature will actually affect how fast the metabolism of that organism works. So it will either speed up or slow down the metabolism, which can kill the animal. And the temperature will also affect the rate at which an organism dries out in the intertidal zone. Salinity will be another abiotic factor. It will affect living things in terms of osmosis. So remember, we talked about osmosis and how water will move to either into or out of cells depending on the salinity outside the cell. So if an animal is in a hypertonic solution, so it's saltier outside the animal than inside, water will tend to leave the animal and can actually dehydrate the animal, which could be bad. Or if they're in a hypotonic solution, they can tend to take up water, which could also be bad because it could kill their cells. So the salinity of the area will also affect the cellular functioning of the animal, depending on whether it is losing or gaining water, or if it's isotonic, that's where it wants to be, where it gains and loses water at the same rate. The pressure will also affect living things. So if they're an animal that is living in the deep sea where the weight of the water is just crushing, they're actually going to need special adaptations to live there rather than up at the surface. So if you've ever dove to the bottom of even just like a 12-foot pool, you know that water has a lot of weight, much more than air, and you can like feel it in your ears, just how much pressure you're under. The amount of nutrients will also affect living things and change the habitat of an animal. So particularly for plants, they need certain nutrients in order to be able to grow and do photosynthesis. And so those kinds of nutrients are going to be things like nitrogen and phosphorus. And then currents will also be an important abiotic factor. So an animal that is sessile, meaning it lives its life attached to a rock or some other surface, will depend on the right amount of currents to take away their waste when they poop, and then also to bring them food. And then other animals will depend on currents as well for transporting their young and their larvae around. So those are the abiotic factors that are going to make up an organism's habitat. But you're also going to have biotic factors. Those are the living things that are found in that area. And so you're going to get like interactions between these organisms that will affect the living things. So like predation. So if the animal is getting hunted by something, or a competition between animals for food, those are going to be biotic factors. So when you get both abiotic and biotic factors combined, you get the habitat of an organism. So all of these abiotic factors come together to form this thing that we call the optimal range for an organism. So the optimal range for an organism is where it's basically the animal's sweet spot, or plant sweet spot. It's where all of the abiotic factors are just right. So the salinity is just right, the temperature is just right, the amount of sunlight is just right, pressure, currents, all of these things are just right for the organism. And so that determines the optimal range. So the abiotic factors mostly determine the optimal range, where the organism functions best. In that optimal range, that's where the animal or plant will function best and be able to reproduce a lot. So as you see on this graph right here, you'll see that in the optimal range, this species of crab, the population is large because it's easily able to find food, and it doesn't have to expend a lot of energy to maintain balance, and so it's able to focus most of its energy on reproducing. So the population is high in the optimal range. However, animals and plants can be pushed out of that optimal range by other things, mostly other animals or plants. It's mostly biotic factors that will force an animal out of its optimal range. And if it does get forced out of its optimal range, an animal can be forced into these things that are called stress zones. So they're just outside of the optimal range. So for our example, let's say that this optimal range right here for this little crab is 15 to 20 degrees Celsius temperature of water. And then let's say another crab comes into this environment and is better at competing for the food that's here. So this crab gets forced out of that area. And let's say it has to go to an area where it's 10 degrees Celsius, or up to an area that's 25 degrees Celsius. Okay. In this area, the crab can survive in these temperatures, but it's much harder for it to survive. It's under a lot more stress. It has to work harder to survive. And so these are called the stress zones. And so because the animal is working so much harder to survive, it's expending a lot more energy. There's less energy that can go into reproduction. And so you can see the population of these animals is much smaller in these stress zones. If the animal gets pushed too far out and it has to go down into water that's like 5 degrees Celsius, or up to water that's like, say, 30 degrees Celsius, that may be too far, and the animal cannot adapt to those temperatures, and so the animal dies. And so you can see that's where the population there is no population, because they can't survive there. And so those are called the zones of intolerance, where the organism can no longer survive. So the optimal range is where it survives best. It is determined by the abiotic factors mostly, and then the biotic factors are the things that can push that animal or plant outside of its optimal range. So we're looking at one of the things that animals and plants require, and that would be a habitat. And there's several different kinds of habitats that you can find. In general, one of the types of habitats that you can find would be a benthic habitat. That would be the seafloor. So when you hear the term benthic or see the term benthic, that means seafloor. It's either on, in, or near the seafloor. There are two types of benthic habitats. Okay, you have a hard surface habitat. So that would be like rocks and stuff and reefs underneath the water. And then you also have a soft surface habitat, which would be like mud flats or like sandy beaches. Those would both be benthic habitats. They would both be the seafloor of the ocean, but they're different kinds. And you get different things that would live in both of those areas. And then you have pelagic. A pelagic habitat, that's the water column. That's anything that's above the bottom. And the pelagic habitat can be divided into two sections. You have the photic zone, which is the top of the ocean, and that's where there's enough light for photosynthesis to occur. And then below that, you have the aphotic zone, and that's where there's not enough light for photosynthesis to occur. And different things will be able to live in either the photic or aphotic zone. We'll go more into that later in the course. And then the last type of habitat that you'll see is the intertidal. That's mostly a benthic habitat, and that's where the land and the ocean meet. It's the part of the land that gets covered and uncovered by the tides every day. And again, we'll spend a whole unit or part of a unit talking about the intertidal zone. Animals may use multiple habitats throughout their lifetime. They may change habitats depending on their life stage and where they're ready to reproduce or whether they're just babies. So let's look at some of these habitats. Here's a benthic habitat, that means the sea bottom. Okay, so we have this top picture on the left here, that's actually the intertidal zone. So this area of the beach would be covered by the water when it's high tide. That's the intertidal. The middle picture right here, that is actually a reef. So that would be a hard bottom habitat. And then the bottom picture on the left here, that's the soft bottom, sandy habitat, benthic habitat. So all of these are benthic. We have the pelagic water, which is the water column. If you look over here on the bottom right, you can see this top layer of the ocean right here. Okay, that is the photic zone. That's where there's enough light for photosynthesis. Below that, all of this is all the aphotic zone where there's not enough light for photosynthesis. And you can see some of the pictures of kinds of creatures that would be found here. Organisms are hard to classify based on where they live because they can actually change locations. So for example, this is Spicula solidissima, the Atlantic surf clam. And so you can see this like tan part down here represents the sand. And you can see right here, this would be the adult phase. Okay, and that adult form is benthic. So it lives on the bottom, and then when that animal is ready to reproduce, it actually releases eggs and sperm into the water, and you have a little larva that will actually spend part of its life floating around in the water column. So it'll have a pelagic habitat. And then when it reaches like its juvenile years here, gets ready to settle down, it will actually settle down, okay, and become a little juvenile clam in the benthic regions again. So the animal's habitat can change throughout its lifetime. Which means that it can be very, very difficult to try and classify an animal based on where it lives because those habitats can change.